We're thrilled to be able to announce our keynote speaker. If you bear with me a little bit, this gentleman needs a very strong introduction because he's quite accomplished and you'll be very impressed. As you know, business has dramatically changed over the past 2 years. I think we've talked a lot about that today. The food industry, and especially restaurants, have acutely experienced these seismic shifts. That's exactly why I'm excited to introduce our next speaker. After opening 33 restaurants over the last 28 years, restaurateur Kevin Boehm has become one of the nation's foremost visionaries in the field of hospitality. Kevin, along with his partner Rob Katz, have built Boca Restaurant Group on great chefs, inspired design, and enlightened hospitality. I'm sure many of you have either eaten or dream of eating at some of their restaurants: Boca, The Girl and the Goat, GT Fish and Oyster, Momotaro, and Swift & Sons. Among their many accolades, in 2019, Kevin and Rob won Outstanding Restaurateur in America at the prestigious James Beard Awards. As a group, they have collected many more honors, including 9 consecutive Michelin stars for Boca and a James Beard Win and Iron Chef designation for Chef Stephanie Izard. Not to rest on his laurels, Kevin in 2020 co-founded Beyond, which is a private wellness club. Yet Kevin's company has had its own challenges in the pandemic. Today, Kevin will share how he was forced to close his restaurants and furlough 1,800 employees, but also how he pivoted to turn those challenges into opportunities, resulting in the fastest growth in his organization's history. With that, please welcome Kevin Boehm.
First of all, I was just looking at that picture. I don't look that young anymore. I think I need to update it. One of my favorite speakers in the world is a guy named Jimmy Valvano. Do you guys know who that is? Jimmy V Foundation? He's captivating to listen to. You should YouTube him. If you look him up, a lot of times the way he liked to organize his speeches was, where have I been? Where am I? And where do I want to be? I think that's a really good outline for today. So there's where I've been, and there's where the restaurant world has been. Let's start with me. So I'm one of those really super lucky guys. At 10 years old, I actually told my parents that I wanted to be a restaurateur. I don't think I said restaurateur, but I said restaurant owner. I didn't really know what that was, but I was a lower middle class kid in Springfield, Illinois, who didn't get to do a lot of things that were opulent. And what I saw on TV is that Rick on Magnum PI owned a bar, and Jack Tripper was a chef, and I occasionally saw Alexis Carrington on Dynasty eat some caviar, and all those things seemed super exciting to me, so I said, let's do that. But it didn't seem very realistic for a kid who had no money, and it wasn't that cool to be in the restaurant business in the 1980s. So I went to University of Illinois, and my 2 roommates, get this, one of them, Mike Hopkins, who was the last American astronaut in space. He was actually the commander of the SpaceX mission. And my other roommate was Dave Eggers. I know there's a lot of journalists in here. Dave was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He wrote both Hologram for the King and The Circle, which became Tom Hanks movies. And he runs and has McSweeney's on the internet. So these 2 guys, I am the loser of that trio. I know this. I know you're all thinking that. That's fine. So there's a night in our college dorm, and Dave was kind of asking me questions, as he does. And he goes, dude, you don't really want to be a lawyer, do you? And I go, no, I don't. And he goes, well, what do you want to do? And I go, well, I really like to open up my own restaurant, but it doesn't seem really realistic for a kid who's got no money from Springfield, Illinois. And he goes, Kevin, Mike here thinks he's going to be an astronaut. I think you can probably figure yours out. So that next semester, with $500 in my pocket, I jumped in my beat-up Suzuki Samurai, and I drove south, and I developed a plan. But before I got to that plan, the plan was I figured I could work in one restaurant and live off of that, take another job, save everything I make off of that, and eventually I would have enough money to open up a restaurant. I said, nobody can tell me that that is not true. I don't know how modest that restaurant will be, but here I go. So I get down there. First of all, I got to Panama City, Florida in January. Nobody was hiring at restaurants. I ended up working at an amusement park. I moved in with a guy that I was working with, caught him stealing from me. I ended up homeless. I then finally saved up enough money to move into a house with another guy, and a bobcat who somebody was keeping as a pet snuck out of their house, snuck into mine, and attacked me. I was asking the universe if I could be a restaurant owner, and I was pretty sure it was telling me no. Then I wrote my first beautiful piece of fiction, which was this made-up resume with several restaurants from Chicago that had mysteriously gone out of business, so they couldn't call for references. And I walked into the most fine dining restaurant there, and I got a job. And I got another job in the afternoon. And eventually, I did save up enough money to open up the world's most modest restaurant, Lazy Days Cafe, in a little town called Seaside, Florida. And Seaside was interesting because if you've ever seen The Truman Show, that's a real city. And Seaside was my very first lesson in what real hospitality was. There was one restaurant in Seaside that was fancier than any other. It was called Josephine's. I had a girlfriend that was older than me that I wanted to impress. I took her there. Restaurant with gyrodons and men in tuxedos, and we went in there. And when I walked into the restaurant, I noticed that the table, the only open table, my table, was next to this very drunk couple where a guy was much too big of a fan of his own jokes, laughing his ass off. I knew that was my table. I was upset. And when the maitre d' sat me down and handed me the menu, there was a Post-it note inside, and it said on it, "Dear Mr. Boehm, the guy on your left is an asshole. Bear with us. He'll be gone soon, and everything's going to be fine." Up until that point, I thought that restaurants and hospitality was very much about rules and precision. And I found out that night that it was kind of whatever you needed to do to make somebody feel good. And that kind of set me off on my career. So I opened Lazy Days. I sold it. I opened up a wine bar, sushi bar, rock and roll bar down the street, sold it, went back to my hometown of Springfield, Illinois, opened up a little restaurant called Indigo with my mom, and then sold it. And then I moved to Nashville, and at that point, I thought that I was a genius. Fortunately, I was still not that smart. That restaurant took me for a ride, and a ride that ended in that restaurant not succeeding. And that was the best learning experience of my life. I thought that Seaside and Springfield were my bachelor's, master's, and my doctorate in restaurants. It turned out that my doctorate in restaurants was failing in Nashville, Tennessee. And I found out if you are a good detective when things go wrong, you can figure out all the things that you need to do to be right. So I moved to Chicago. Thank God. This is always where I wanted to be. After I failed, my mom gave me a very good piece of advice. She said, "You always wanted to go to Chicago. You've always been able to make something happen. Go to Chicago and make something happen." That making something happen was having coffee with a guy named Rob Katz. And 20 years ago, next year, Boca's about to turn 20, we opened our very first restaurant, Boca, in this town. And that restaurant, I'm more emotional about that restaurant than any other restaurant because when I look at that restaurant, I can see my children, I can see my family. A lot of stuff has happened to me within that space. So we built a company around multiple chefs. And we built this architecture of our company sitting at that bar at Boca in the wee hours of the morning, usually over some sort of tequila on the rocks or a glass of Cabernet. And Rob and I, what we saw out in the universe at that point was there were a lot of restaurant groups that were either built around concepts or they were built around one chef. The Mario Battalis of the world, the Wolfgang Pucks of the world, the John Georges of the world, the Danielle Boulud's of the world. And I think you can see with the Mario Battalis of the world why only having one chef can maybe be problematic. So what we said is, perhaps what we do, yes, you can laugh. You're allowed to laugh. What we decided to do is, what if we built a dynamic company where we were like talent scouts? We found great chefs, and then we could build great restaurants around the talent that we found. And then we could do anything. We could do Japanese restaurants, we could do Chinese restaurants, we could do steakhouses. We were just looking for great talent. So what has that moved into? So now today, we're about 30 restaurants in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, 2,000 employees, 30 restaurants, and 7 chef partners A guy named Michael Solomonoff, who was born in Jerusalem, that we have an Israeli restaurant with in New York that we're about to have 2 more. The great Stephanie Izard, she has the food equivalent of the EGOT. She has won the James Beard Award. She has won Food and Wine's Best New Chefs. She is an Iron Chef, and she won Top Chef. Nobody else has done that. Gene Cotto, our amazing chef at Momotaro and Itoko. Giuseppe Tintori at the GTs. Daniel Rose, that we're doing 2 French restaurants with. He's Le Coucou in New York. Lee Wolin, that we have Boca and Alavita. And Chris Pandel, that we have Swift & Sons and Sierra at the Hoxton Hotel. So what was the restaurant world like specifically way back when? Well, I will tell you that first restaurant that I worked in, chefs were still throwing pans and were still throwing the occasional knife. You cannot do that anymore. But also, the financial model of a restaurant back then was such that you could really make a lot of money in the restaurant business if you hit it right. It's a very simple formula. 30% cost of goods sold, 30% labor, 4% occupancy, 20% everything else. We call that word silo. Would leave you 20% profit. That was actually attainable back then, which is really amazing. We also back then thought nothing about sustainability or the world's resources. Cooking regionally and seasonally was actually something you could brag about. It was not a core competency at that point. And if you mentioned equity and inclusion to people, they would just stare at you really confused. So 1991, when I worked in that first restaurant, to 2020, there was an evolution. We were better at some things than we were at others, but there wasn't a revolution. And then we got rocked. So I definitely did. So I have a friend named Michael Ealy. Michael's a great actor in LA, and we were out to dinner recently, and he told me a story of him doing a play. The play was, imagine this entire set being a basketball court, a real basketball court, and then another little mini set of a guy in an apartment watching the basketball game. And when you walked into the theater, everybody was doing choreographed slam dunks and layups and all those sort of stuff, and then the play started. And in the play, the guy in the little apartment was an obsessive fan of this basketball game, and it gets to the end of the play, and Michael has realized during the play that sitting right in front of him, right in front of the stage, is Philip Seymour Hoffman. So he's a little bit nervous. At the end of the play, Michael gets the basketball. They're down by 1. He shoots a 14-foot jump shot, makes it. They win the game. Everybody celebrates. The play ends. Michael goes in the back. He cuts out the side door. And when he goes out the side door, Philip Seymour Hoffman's leaned up against a pole, and he goes, "What happens if you miss it?" Michael goes, "It's a different ending." He goes, "Well, what's the other ending?" And he goes, "You got to come on a night when I miss." So when he told me that story, I immediately thought of the food business. When you walk into one of my restaurants on any given night, this gentleman right there could have the absolute time of his life. The person he's with could catch their hair on fire from the candle that's on the table. What I have always done is figured out what we were going to do in both scenarios. I knew what we were going to do. I always wrote 2 endings. The pandemic was an ending I never even thought of. So it's March 7th. I'm in Philadelphia for the Chef Conference. This is of 2020. And Kwame Onwuachi, who was just the host of the James Beard Awards, walks in to speak, and he's wearing a mask. And I think to myself, what the fuck is Kwame wearing a mask for? Turns out he was sick. But it was a little conversation between all of us. That seems aggressive that he's wearing a mask. Didn't seem aggressive about a week later. So I leave Philly Chef Conference, and I got called to Springfield, Illinois. My mom had been sick for some time, and it turned out that was going to be the last week that I spent with my mom. So stuff started to happen in the world, pandemics and otherwise. My business partner was trying to keep me shielded from it. And on March 14th, my mom took her last breath. On March 15th, we were let know that we couldn't have a funeral because they were going to shut everything down. It's also the last night that we were able to dine in restaurants. So walked into a restaurant, that same restaurant that I opened with her in Springfield, Illinois, filled with her paintings on the wall, and that ended up kind of being the funeral. sitting in a restaurant surrounded by her paintings. We felt like we were surrounded by her. And then the very next day, I drove to Springfield, Illinois, and we figured out that we had to shut 18 restaurants down and furlough 1,850 employees. That, without question, I can even talk about it right now and feel the sadness, was the hardest 3 days of my life. I barely remember that 72 hours. The very next morning, I got a text from someone. It was a group text. There was a few people on it. There were well-known people in the food world, and they said, hey, Kevin, I know you're going through a lot right now, but maybe we all need support. And 17 people jumped on a phone call on March 17th, and what came out of that was the Independent Restaurant Coalition. And that original conversation was, is there someone out there who understands the food business and understands the independent food business who is thinking about us and is in our corner? And we thought the answer was no. So we said, what do we do? Some smart people on the phone. Sam Cass, who was Obama's chef, who was the head of the nutrition policy for the US, said, well, we probably should hire a lobbyist. And we knew we needed some money, and we knew we needed some PR. We did those three things, and we were off to the races. We raised $300,000 immediately. And you know what we did? We wrote a bill. We wrote a bill. Earl Blumenauer from Oregon wrote the actual white paper for the House bill with our help. Roger Wicker wrote the Senate version of it. And we were on 4 Zooms a day, and what came out of that was $28.6 billion in grants. Eventually, it passed the House. We celebrated watching it on C-SPAN. We actually got invited to the White House, and ultimately became part of the CARES Act, and we did save some restaurants. But what the pandemic exposed through all of that, and all those people that I was talking to during that time, was the fragility of the restaurant model specifically needed to be changed. That 30-30-16-4 that I mentioned to you before, it's not 30 anymore for labor, it's 40 for labor. That 4 for occupancy, no, that's more like 6 to 8, and if you live in New York, it's 10. That 16 that was kind of everything else encompassed is now 20. So that only number that we really could mess with was that cost of goods sold number. And that's one of the things that we started to move the needle on and are continuing to move the needle on. One thing that we saw was that t-shirt that you bought in 1991 that was like 20 bucks, that thing's now $55. But our sit-down hamburger in 1991 at a nice restaurant was 16 or 18 bucks, and it was still 16 or 18 bucks. So as we're sitting around and talking with all these people, we're like, how can there be a collective where we can all understand that there has to be a new model? Our ability to help each other had to change, and we had to find one credible source for that. The credible source for me when I started was I bought a book. When I was 20 years old, there was a book called Restaurants That Work. It was 20 case studies on restaurants. How many people are here from Chicago? Anybody remember Scoozy? The very first restaurant in that book was Scoozy. I had no idea what restaurant labor should be, what food costs should be, all those sort of things. That was my first entry into that. Now that everything has changed, we need to have a new source for that again. And the IRC can be one of those things. Also, one of the things that the IRC opened up was the fact that we could actually, for the very first time, be vulnerable with each other. So if you've ever seen 2 restaurateurs in the street, it's a bit of a cartoon. Because the one person will say to him, how are you doing over your restaurant? You'll be like, oh my God, I'm so busy. I just don't have enough chairs. And the other guy, how are you doing? And he's like, oh my God, I just need more people to answer the phone. Nobody would ever let their guard down. And for the very first time in those IRC calls, we were talking about all these things, and we had the ability to actually say to each other, I don't know if I'm going to be open anymore. And this was something that actually we dealt with. When you turn the spigot of cash off inside of a restaurant, very, very quickly, you fall behind and there's no cash flow left. Rob and I went to our bank. We were lucky. They caught me at a time in my career when I could do this, when I could go to a bank and ask them for a line of credit. But within 4 months, that line of credit went from 0 to $6 million. I had one restaurant that was $1 million in rent. I had another restaurant that was $2 million in rent. But now I want to talk about the biggest problem that we have right now in the restaurant business. And it started at the pandemic and continues. And that's lack of people to execute our big ideas. I always had big ideas. And somehow, I always seem to have people. When we hired for Girl on the Go the very first time, 800 people showed up to apply. There was a line down the street. Last week, every single one of my restaurants is hiring. We had 17 total applications. One of the things that we need in this country is immigration reform. And there are 1.1 million undocumented immigrants that work in restaurants, and we need employment-based immigration in this country. There are people that want to come to this country. Everybody needs workers in this country right now. And if there's one thing that the IRC should pivot to right now that the legislation is done for getting money for restaurants, it is trying to figure that out. Immigrants are a large part of the fabric of this restaurant community, and this needs to be a discussion piece and an agenda piece. We also need to be better at our jobs. I always talk about stories within the restaurant business. And if we're going to attract more people to work in restaurants and be able to execute food, we need to get some of those good stories out there. When we looked at our company, we had to take a really long, hard look at what we did well and what we did not so well. One of those big things was taking a look at our company and hiring a director of equity and inclusion inside our restaurant. So there was somebody out there who could look at us and grade us and tell us if we were doing better or not. It is a competitive industry, and now more than ever, it's competitive at being the absolute best employers. And what I grew up in was not a healthy environment. My very first day in my job at the beach house, I was having some family issues at home. I was telling it to another server. The manager took me into the office, and he goes, "I'm only going to say this once to you, Kevin. Leave your fucking baggage at home." That's what I grew up into. And now it's finding a healthier place and having an understanding that the word restaurant comes from restoration. And if you really want people to restore people within your restaurants, you've got to help restore them so they can do that for other people. The restaurant world, too, has a bit of a PR problem. And if you look at a lot of the restaurant blogs, most of their stories are negative stories. And there are stories that are bad stories within restaurants that are to be told. But I'm telling you, I see it every single day. There are so many amazing stories that happen in restaurants all the time, and they need to be told. Lee Wolin is my chef partner at Boca and at Alavida. Here's a kid who grew up on the other side of the tracks in Cleveland and was so far away from fine dining, but somehow, by 8 years old, developed a love of cooking and was cooking in the kitchen by himself. By the time he turned 18, he was already writing Ferran Adria in Madrid, Spain. The #1 restaurant in the world, El Bulli, was writing him and saying, "I'd love to come and work inside your restaurant." Eventually, he received an answer from that, and he went to Madrid, stayed in a little tiny dorm room, worked for free, and spent 6 months working at the #1 restaurant in the world. A couple years later, he found himself working in 11 Madison Park in New York, became the #2 chef there. It became the #1 restaurant in the world. And just to let you know how lucky I am, I just happened to drift into that kitchen one night and have dinner. He walked up to me, said, I'd been to your restaurant, Boca, in Chicago, and I'm a big fan. I'd love to reach out to you sometime. I gave him my card, and that's how we got together all these years later. There are so many stories like that about how restaurants have saved people's lives. They've saved mine. It's been my opiate all these years, and I hope we can tell more of those stories. The restaurant world pre-pandemic was 16.1 million people in the entire supply chain. That's 500,000 restaurants. 100,000 of those restaurants are gone. 30% of that labor force is gone. The good news right now is that our 2019 numbers are about the same right now as they were before. We are just doing a whole lot more with less. So how do we change our fortunes and have all this explosive growth that we have right now? Well, we turned a couple of these want-to-bes into reality. The #1 is traditional retail is sort of going away a little bit. But developers still need restaurants to define their developments and to define their neighborhoods. We have been able to go in there and negotiate management contracts where we put no money in, get a percentage of top line and a percentage of bottom line, and right now that's all we're doing. 2, doing more with less. Going in and designing restaurants that allow you to still give the same amount of service, but just with more speed. Building dining rooms with tables that have drawers underneath that have 3 resets inside of them. So when somebody goes to reset the table, there's already a table turn in there. I can wipe it, my resets are right there, and I can go. 1.5 times the size of POSs that exist inside the dining room, so everybody can get their orders in faster. We have to design restaurants with more speed right now so we can do more. And then there's still some of these want-to-bes that we're still working on. I think everybody here knows by 2050 we have to produce 60% more food. That seems daunting, right? What are all these things that we can do? Plant-based food, lab-based food, reducing food waste, improving wild fisheries management. This needs to be an agenda piece for every farmer, scientist, and food production person right now if we're going to make it. And the last thing that we're moving towards is a 4-day work week, because that's the sustainable work week within restaurants with all these people and what they want in their life right now, which is balance. So 9 restaurants in construction right now, better deals, better quality of life, and an improved ability to leverage what we're doing financially, which allow us to pay people better and keep opening up restaurants. That's what's happening for us right now. And then 2 cool things on the horizon. 1, unusual partnerships. Middle of pandemic, got Michael Solomonov from Philadelphia, incredible chef, texted me one day and he goes, "How you doing over there?" I said, "Terrible." I said, "How you doing?" He said, "Terrible." He goes, "You want to bitch about it together?" I said, "Yeah." So we jump on the phone and I said, I got a project in New York. This might sound stupid because you have a restaurant group and I have a restaurant group, but what if we super group and do it together? Because you've got a commissary kitchen, you could truck it from Philly. I've got all the bandwidth and financial people and HR and that sort of thing. And he's like, "Sounds dreamy, let's do it." 2 days ago, the New York Post came out. We just got named, the headline was New York's Restaurant of the Summer, Laser Wolf. So it ended up turning out to be to go well. And part of it was that whole bandwidth. So I think there's a lot of unusual partnerships that can happen. Also, when you look at fast food and you look at what I do, I think the distance between utility food experiences and actual restaurant experience are going to widen. I think the young people of today do not want to talk to humans when they go into that restaurant, when they're going into getting their burger. I think that technology is going to lead to seeing less people in those types of restaurants and separate that from the things that I do, which is true experiences and true professionals inside of restaurants. And then finally, mentioned in the intro that I opened up a wellness private club. I have a private club that has 8 doctors inside of it. You onboard with an executive physical. There is a naturopath. There's a doctor of Chinese medicine. There's a psychiatrist. There's a plastic surgeon. There are all these things inside the house. The naturopath is what I want to talk about. Sitting with the doctor, the internist, to do the integrated blood piece, but also wearing a glucose monitor and sitting with him has completely changed the way that I eat. And I think as we look at the way people eat moving forward, they're going to eat foods that work the best for them. I found out that if I eat soy sauce past 6:30, my glucose level shoots up like a rocket and then I don't sleep very well. I've been able to tie these things in. This is stuff that everybody's going to know pretty soon. And I think it's going to change the way we eat. I think it's going to change the types of food that we eat pretty soon, because it's not just about tasting great food, it's about feeling great, and people definitely want to feel great. Constant reinvention of our companies, I think, is so important. Any company that says we do it this way because that's the way we've always done it, I think that's going to be a tough slide for them moving forward. Few things our company always says. Positivity is contagious, be a carrier of happiness. Every difficult conversation needs a countermeasure. Balance the positive with the negative. Don't just give guests a great experience, develop a relationship. Execution eats strategy for breakfast. Inspect what you expect. See the problem, solve the problem, teach the solution. And finally, currently take stock in where we've been, where we are, and where we want to be. I have 4 stories that are essential to my life. I've always told them. I think they're great lessons in the restaurant business. One is about the fact that you can't run out the clock in the restaurant business. One's about being creative. One is about staying humble. And one's about finding greatness in unusual places. So first story is, worst customer I ever had was a guy named Herb. Oh, I can't say his name. Damn it, I never do that. I almost said his last name. Fine, it's that cat's out of the bag, it's Herb. Herb used to send me the longest emails about his dining experiences with me. And it would be like, Dear Kevin, I came in the other night and your host was wearing dusty flats. I think they should have better footwear at this restaurant. That's a real one right there, by the way. I got so aggravated by Herb's emails. They made me crazy. And so one night I said, tonight we're going to beat Herb. I called everybody out, everybody from the back, everybody from the front. I go, I don't care what we do tonight, but this guy will not have one thing bad to say about this restaurant. Change your shoes. And so I was waiting for him at the valet. So, Herb, nice to see you. How are you? Oh, how are you? Let me take that ticket for you. And brought him in. And the person who had taken the reservation the night before had taken it properly. And guess what? His table was ready exactly. And we sat him. And the server came out. And she was compelling. And the food came out hot food hot and cold food cold. And when he went to the bathrooms, they were perfectly clean. And when the pastry came out, it was perfectly cooked by every single prep cook who had looked at it. 8 people said goodbye to him on the way out. He walked up to me and he put his hands on my shoulders and he goes, Kevin, now that's a goddamn dining experience. Thank you, Herb. I appreciate it. Herb walked out. I high-fived the general manager. I went by and high-fived the chef. I was so happy. I came and walked back out of the dining room and I'm looking. And all of a sudden, 3 minutes later, Herb's walking back in. He goes, where is my car? No! Everybody has a customer. Everybody has a client. Everybody has a beginning to that process and an end to that process. I forgot what the end of that process was. My second story is about being creative. I had a little place called Indigo Wine Bar in Seaside, Florida. And one day, a guy came by. He had a bottle of 61 Lafite Rothschild, a first growth, one of the most expensive bottles in the world. His father had given it to him on his wedding day. His father was now passed, and they had built this whole anniversary party around opening this bottle of wine so they could drink it. So he wanted me to decant it before they came in. I went to open it. Cork disintegrated. It was corked. The man cried in front of me. I said, do you want me to try to find you another bottle? He goes, I could never afford that bottle of wine. I go, I might have a trick up my sleeve. Guy lived down the street, had a huge wine collection. His name was Bob Bannerman. I also knew that he was a romantic. I called Bob and I said, Bob, I got a story for you. He goes, I got a bottle of 66 Lafite. It's no 61, but it's not bad. I'll sell it to you for $300. Guy said, sold. I went and I grabbed it, decanted that bottle, perfect. Everybody came in. The only people that knew that juice was not a 61 were me and the gentleman. Poured everybody a glass of wine. He gave a toast to everybody. And then the man poured me a little bit, came over to me, hugged me, kissed me on both cheeks. And he whispered in my ear, you're a beautiful liar, young man. And we clanged. Alinea is right next to Boca. Grant Achatz, very famous chef. While we've been neighbors for many, many years, Gourmet Magazine had named them the #1 restaurant in America right before this. And a man one night comes in with a 10-gallon cowboy hat, him and his wife, and goes to the table, and the server comes over and he goes, hey, we have the 12-course menu and the 24-course menu. And the man says, if you're the best restaurant in America, you ought to be able to cook the best damn steak in America. And the server said, let me go talk to Chef. I'll be right back. And he goes, Chef, the guy says, we're the best restaurant in America. We've got to be able to cook the best steak in America. And Grant says, man's got a point. Go get in your car and go to Sur La Table and get me a big copper presentation pan. They were serving real Kobe. He cut off a huge piece of real Kobe for them. Garnished it with some bouquet garni, took it to the table, put it in the center of the table with 2 knives and 2 plates. Man eats the steak, calls the server over and says, son, that was the best steak I ever had in my entire life. Now give me the whole tour. They ate all 24 courses after that. I love that story so much because Grant had just been named the best restaurant in the United States, and he was still willing to go and be above that and say, this is what this guy wants, let's have fun with it. My final story is a story I tell at every single restaurant opening. It's my favorite story. I was going to open up a restaurant in St. Louis, Missouri. I was driving from Springfield to St. Louis at the time, and we stopped off at a Wendy's Hamburgers on the way there. I walked in, and there was a woman perched at the front, and she was like, "Gentlemen, welcome to Wendy's." Never seen a maitre d' at a fast food restaurant before, so I was a little taken aback. I said, "Thank you very much." I walked to the front of the line. The man up there told us about the Dave's Spicy Chicken Sandwich like he was working in a Michelin 3-star restaurant. I'll take that spicy chicken sandwich, and I'll take a water. They had a super bar back then, with pasta and salad and that sort of thing. The woman who was perched at the front was also keeping that immaculately clean. And then at one point came by, and she re-poured my water with a pitcher. Now, my friend and I hadn't said anything about this yet, but after pouring the water, I looked at him and said, "What the hell is going on?" We said, "We have to go talk to the manager." So we asked for the manager, and the woman said, "Yeah, is there a problem?" I said, No, there's no problem." He came out, and we said, "I got to tell you, you're the best run fast food restaurant I've ever seen in my entire life. It's very impressive. You must be very impressive." And he said, "Well, as you can see, we're very proud of it." And on the wall, they were the #1 Wendy's in the United States. Everything we're all doing food-wise are cover songs, man. They're cover songs. Every time the Beatles wrote a song, they were the standard bearer until, with a little help from my friends, Joe Cocker did it, made it sound like a song that wasn't even the Beatles' song, and did the best possible version of it. Every time we all go out, we need to do the best cover version of something that we can, possibly. I have the greatest job in the world. I get to be around people all the time. I get to be ringside for some of the greatest moments in people's lives. I think the future is bright in this business, but we need to be creative. We need to figure out how to get more workers. We need to figure out how to produce more food. And we need to tell good stories about the food business so people want to be inside of it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.